My name is Daniel Harris, and by the time Mark Reynolds leaned back in his chair and told me I wasn't ready, something inside me went hollow in a way I didn't know how to name, because the loss wasn't loud or public. It was quiet and surgical, the slow removal of the future I'd been building with every late night, every swallowed frustration, every moment I chose loyalty over leverage. And as he spoke in those soft, managerial half-sentences, I felt the humiliation sink past anger into numbness, into the realization that 7 years of excellence had been reduced to a convenient lie so someone more socially useful could wear my work like a borrowed suit. I smiled, nodded, thanked him for the feedback, and walked out with my posture intact, while internally something collapsed, my sense of fairness, my belief that effort mattered, my identity as the dependable one. And in the weeks that followed, as I watched James Walker settle into the role I had already been performing for free, I understood that what I'd lost wasn't just a title, but my name inside that building, my voice in meetings, my imagined future version of myself. And the rage that grew wasn't explosive or emotional. It was cold and mathematical, a patient recalibration where every restraint became deliberate and every silence carried weight, because I wasn't planning to scream or quit or beg. I was planning to let the system choke on the absence of the person it had quietly decided it could exploit forever. And the day HR finally noticed, the day Mark's confidence cracked just enough for him to look confused instead of superior, I knew the damage was already irreversible, because that was the moment I stopped trying to survive. I remember the room first. The office smelled faintly of burnt coffee and carpet cleaner, the kind of neutral corporate scent designed to make everything feel temporary. Mark Reynolds sat across from me, relaxed, comfortable, like this conversation was routine, like it wouldn't alter the trajectory of my life. I had rehearsed this meeting for weeks. In my head, I'd walked in calm, confident, already half celebrating. 7 years. 7 years of staying late when others logged off. 7 years of fixing reports before clients ever knew they were broken. 7 years of training new hires who would eventually outrank me. I saw his lips move before I fully heard the words. "Daniel, you're good at what you do, but you're not quite ready for leadership yet." What I saw, his chair tilt back slightly, his hands folding together, his eyes never leaving mine. What I felt, a sharp drop in my chest like an elevator cable snapping without the fall ever coming. What I didn't say, ask for examples, ask for metrics, ask why my performance reviews suddenly meant nothing. What I pretended not to notice, that the decision had already been made long before I walked in. I nodded. I even smiled. I said something polite. I thanked him for the feedback. Inside, everything fractured. I walked back to my desk and sat down like nothing had changed, answered emails, adjusted a report, smiled at a coworker who congratulated me in advance, not knowing the congratulations were already a ghost. 2 weeks later, the announcement went out. James Walker, operations manager. People clapped. Mark looked proud. James looked nervous, but excited. That's when the disturbing detail surfaced, the one that made the betrayal rot instead of sting. I found out the promotion had been discussed during a golf weekend, not in a boardroom, not in a performance review, on a course in Michigan between drinks and jokes and favors. I hadn't lost because I wasn't good enough. I'd lost because I wasn't there. That realization didn't make me angry at first. It made me empty. Because if effort didn't matter, then who exactly had I been for 7 years? Outwardly, I stayed calm. Inwardly, my identity was unraveling thread by thread. I wasn't the reliable one anymore. I wasn't the future leader. I was the invisible engine they assumed would keep running no matter what. Something permanent was taken that day.
Not just status, not just a title, but the version of myself that believed loyalty was safe. I began to notice things I hadn't before. How often Mark leaned on me without acknowledging it. How frequently James asked questions I already knew the answers to. How systems worked because I was there, not because they were well designed. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't complain. I didn't change my tone. I changed my boundaries. And as I sat at my desk one evening, watching the office lights shut off one by one while I packed my bag on time for the first time in years, a thought settled in with disturbing clarity. This hadn't been an accident. This wasn't oversight. This was strategy. And once I understood that, I realized something else. If it was planned, then so could what came next.
After the announcement, everything slowed down in a way that felt unnatural, like the office itself was holding its breath. I stayed quiet. That was the first thing people noticed, even if they couldn't articulate it. Daniel Harris was still there. Same desk, same login, same calm expression. But something essential had gone offline. I watched them celebrate from the edges. James shaking hands, Mark laughing a little too loudly, emails flying back and forth congratulating the fresh leadership direction. I read every word, I memorized every tone, and I said nothing. Silence, I learned quickly, makes people sloppy. James tried hard at first. He scheduled long meetings, asked questions he should already know, leaned heavily on phrases like big picture and alignment. I answered when asked, briefly, precisely, never volunteering more than required. Mark seemed relaxed, almost relieved, like a difficult variable had finally been neutralized. They underestimated the quiet. They always do. To them, silence meant acceptance. It meant I'd swallowed it and moved on. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't withdrawing, I was observing. I started noticing patterns, which reports James reviewed personally and which he skimmed, how Mark relied on surface-level dashboards without checking the raw data beneath, how the London office deferred to Chicago on certain metrics that, quietly, only I fully understood. Years of helpfulness had given me something no title ever could: complete visibility. I knew where the system bent instead of breaking. I knew which deadlines were flexible and which ones only looked that way. I stayed invisible. I arrived on time. I left on time. I documented everything. The first shift was small, almost polite, a minor regional performance report. One I used to quietly reconcile before submission went out exactly as generated. No manual correction, no gentle adjustment. The numbers were technically accurate. They were also deeply misleading. Nothing exploded, but I saw the ripple immediately. A confused follow-up email, a request for clarification, James answering with confidence he didn't have. I watched Mark skim the response and move on. That was my first win. Not loud, not obvious, but satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. What surprised me most wasn't how easy it was how calm I felt doing it. There was no rush of anger, no thrill, just a steady, controlled awareness that I was finally acting in alignment with reality instead of expectation. I wasn't sabotaging, I was withdrawing compensation, letting the system reflect what it actually was without me propping it up. Then I noticed the weakness. James didn't understand the London escalation protocols. He thought they were automated. They weren't. They relied on judgment calls, my judgment calls about when to absorb issues quietly and when to flag them. Without that filter, small problems grew teeth, and because I was no longer absorbing them, they started surfacing at the worst possible times. Client calls grew tense. Timelines slipped just enough to be noticed. Mark's calendar filled up.
Still, no one blamed me. Not yet. Why would they? I was doing my job, exactly my job, cleanly, professionally, by the book. That was the beauty of it. There was nothing to confront, nothing to accuse, just an absence that felt heavier every week. One afternoon, I overheard Mark say my name in a hallway conversation, not angrily, confused, like he was trying to remember where a piece used to fit. I didn't react. I kept typing. I kept my posture relaxed. Inside, I marked the moment. The system was starting to feel the strain. The mini-revenge wasn't about damage. It was about contrast. They were beginning to see the difference between having me and merely employing me. I went home that night and slept better than I had in months. Not because I was winning, but because I was no longer lying to myself. I wasn't hoping for fairness anymore. I was counting on inevitability. And as I lay there in the dark, one thought stayed with me, steady and certain. They thought it was over. I knew it had just started.
The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They seeped in, slow, uneven, impossible to trace back to a single moment. That's what made them frightening. I could feel the shift in the building before anyone said it out loud, the subtle tightening in conversations, the way people stopped joking in meetings, the new habit Mark developed of double-checking his phone mid-sentence like he was waiting for something bad to appear. I stayed exactly the same tone, same pace, same neutral expressions. Inside, though, I was learning how pressure really works. The flawed report I let pass untouched didn't collapse anything on its own. It did something worse. It exposed how dependent the operation had been on unacknowledged human judgment. James tried to patch the confusion with confidence, then with meetings, then with more meetings. Each attempt made him look less prepared. London started escalating issues earlier, louder, copying more people. Mark responded by tightening control, asking for more visibility, more summaries, more assurances. And the more they tried to clamp down, the more obvious it became that no one was actually steering. I watched James change first. His posture stiffened. He stopped improvising in meetings and started reading from notes. He asked me questions twice, then 3 times, about processes I'd explained years ago. I answered carefully, factually, without tone, without correction. He began arriving earlier than me and leaving later, like effort alone might close the gap. It didn't. Effort without understanding only made the cracks louder. Mark's change was quieter, more dangerous. He stopped assuming competence and started scanning for threats. His emails grew sharper, shorter. He asked for backups on backups. He began looping HR into conversations that didn't require them. Paranoia doesn't announce itself. It disguises itself as diligence. I saw it settling into him like a habit he couldn't break. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I noticed myself changing too. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cruel. I felt hollowed and precise. Revenge, I realized, wasn't making me feel powerful. It was stripping me down to function. I measured words. I calculated timing. I started thinking in contingencies instead of hopes. The man who once believed in being indispensable had been replaced by someone who understood the danger of being visible. That loss hit me harder than I expected. I'd given up a version of myself I couldn't get back. But I kept going, because stopping now would mean admitting the damage had been for nothing. The pressure accelerated when a major quarterly review loomed, a multi-region performance assessment tied to contract renewals. Miss it, mishandle it, or misrepresent it, and the fallout wouldn't stay internal. Compliance eyes, external auditors, questions no one wanted asked. The timeline was tight, the data messy, the margin for error non-existent. I could feel the tension coiling tighter every day.
I heard James arguing on the phone in a stairwell. I saw Mark pacing during lunch instead of eating. I watched HR quietly request documentation just in case. They were scared, not of me, of uncertainty, and I was pretending to be harmless. That was the most exhausting part. Sitting in meetings while knowing exactly where the weak points were, listening to reassurances I knew were fragile, holding back corrections that would have stabilized things temporarily but erased the lesson permanently. It took discipline not to intervene, discipline not to save them from themselves, because once you step back in, you become responsible again. I asked myself a question I didn't like the answer to. Was I doing this for justice or control? The line had blurred. I didn't feel good about that. I felt committed. There's a difference. The deadline crept closer. The review required source data pulled from legacy systems few people remembered how to navigate. Systems I had built workarounds for years ago. Systems with assumptions baked in, assumptions only I knew how to validate. I listened as James assured Mark it was handled. I watched Mark nod, not convinced, but out of options. No one asked me for help, and I didn't offer it. Late one evening, alone in the office, I logged into a system I hadn't touched in months. Not to fix anything, just to confirm something I already suspected. The access still worked. The permissions were still there. The old folders untouched. Years of institutional memory sitting quietly behind a login no one thought to revoke, because no one thought it mattered. I closed my laptop slowly, carefully, because in that moment I understood the full shape of what I was holding, and I realized that if I chose to use it, there would be no way back, only forward, through consequences no one else could stop, because I wasn't just watching the collapse anymore. I had access to the switch that could end everything. The first visible crack appeared on a Tuesday morning, the kind of ordinary day no one prepares for. An email from London hit the executive distribution list, polite, measured, but unmistakably public, requesting clarification on discrepancies in the quarterly performance figures that had already been shared with two major clients. Not asking for help, asking for an explanation. I watched Mark read it from across the floor. I saw the way his jaw tightened before he forced his expression back into something neutral. Chaos never announces itself loudly at first. It clears its throat. Meetings multiplied, emergency syncs, quick alignments that lasted over an hour. I sat in every one of them, calm, attentive, saying just enough to appear cooperative. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't contradict James, even when I knew he was wrong, especially when I knew he was wrong. Letting people speak confidently into a widening gap is its own kind of pressure. The room filled with reassurance that sounded thinner each time it was repeated. By midweek, the consequences were no longer theoretical. One client postponed a renewal call. Another asked for raw data access instead of summaries. That request alone sent a visible ripple through management. Raw data meant exposure. It meant assumptions couldn't hide behind charts anymore. Mark tried to project control, but his voice lost its rhythm. He was improvising now, and improvisation had never been his strength. James cornered me near the printers that afternoon. His tone was friendly, too friendly. He asked if I'd noticed any oddities in the reports. I met his eyes, kept my voice steady, and told him everything looked consistent with the source data I'd seen, which was true. He thanked me, visibly relieved, and walked away with confidence that wasn't earned. I stood there a moment longer, listening to the printer hum, thinking about how long ago this path had actually started. Long before the promotion, long before the meeting. I'd seen the writing on the wall years earlier, back when being helpful felt like job security. That was when I began documenting processes no one else bothered to learn, when I built parallel records for my own reference, when I noticed how access was granted freely and almost never reviewed. None of it felt like revenge then. It felt like professionalism, preparedness, insurance.
I didn't know who I was protecting myself from yet. I just knew the system rewarded memory without acknowledging it. By Thursday, Mark stopped pretending everything was fine. He called me into his office, closed the door, and dropped the casual tone. He asked directly why things felt harder lately, why so many small issues were suddenly surfacing. His eyes searched my face for something: guilt, defensiveness, reassurance. I gave him none of it. I reminded him calmly that I was focused on my defined responsibilities and meeting expectations as outlined. I even referenced his words back to him, carefully: "Not ready for leadership." The phrase hung in the air between us like a receipt. He didn't threaten me. He didn't accuse me. He couldn't. Instead, he tried something else. He hinted at future opportunities, at reconsideration, at how these things tend to work out for people who stay flexible. I listened politely. I nodded at the right moments. Inside, I felt nothing, because the plan had already moved beyond persuasion. It was in motion now, touching people and processes I didn't have to be present for anymore. The audit notice arrived Friday morning, not formal yet, just a heads up. Compliance wanted to understand alignment. Mark forwarded it with a short note asking everyone to be responsive. His confidence was gone now. He walked the floor instead of staying in his office. He watched conversations instead of leading them. Fear had made him visible. I stayed calm. That was the part that unnerved them most. James finally snapped that afternoon. He pulled me aside, voice low, asking if I was trying to make a point. There it was, the accusation without evidence, the realization without proof. I told him no. I told him I was doing my job, exactly as described. The truth, delivered without emotion, has a way of ending arguments before they begin. He stared at me like he wanted to say more, but couldn't figure out how. What none of them knew, what made all their reactions feel late, was that the real damage had already happened weeks ago, quietly, procedurally, with timestamps and access logs that couldn't be undone. The review process they were scrambling to prepare for was already poisoned by assumptions they'd never validated, decisions already made, numbers already circulated, the momentum irreversible. That Friday evening, as the office emptied, Mark stood alone by his desk, staring at his screen long after everyone else had left. I walked past him on my way out, wished him a good weekend, and meant it in the most unsettling way possible. Because by then, the collapse wasn't coming anymore. It had already begun.
By the time the audit became real, not theoretical, I could feel the strain in my own body, the kind that settles behind the eyes and doesn't leave when you sleep. Compliance requests started arriving with deadlines attached, short ones, non-negotiable ones. Mark forwarded them with clipped messages, no longer pretending this was routine. James stopped trying to sound confident and started trying to sound innocent. Everyone was scrambling, and for the first time I understood how close I was to the edge of my own control. Because if this went wrong, if even one assumption collapsed the wrong way, it wouldn't just destroy them, it would expose me too. That was the part I hadn't fully accounted for. Revenge looks clean when you imagine it. In practice, it bleeds into everything. I began double-checking my own actions, my own emails, my own access logs. Paranoia isn't contagious, it's environmental. I started waking up before my alarm, heart already racing, replaying conversations from days earlier, searching for cracks. Had I said too much? Too little? Had someone noticed the pattern forming around my silence? There were moments, quiet, dangerous ones, where I considered stopping, stepping in, fixing just enough to stabilize things, walking away with my conscience intact and my future uncertain but unburned. I pictured it vividly, the relief on Mark's face, the gratitude he'd never admit out loud, the return to being reliable Daniel. The thought made my stomach turn, not because it was wrong, because it was familiar, because it would mean sacrificing myself again to preserve people who had already decided I was expendable. The near collapse came on a Wednesday afternoon. Compliance requested a reconciliation document tied to a legacy system integration, one I knew was flawed at the structural level. If submitted without context, it would trigger deeper questions. If contextualized improperly, it would look like intentional misrepresentation. James panicked. He scheduled an emergency meeting and, for the first time, explicitly asked me for help. Not guidance, help. The room went quiet when he said my name. Every instinct told me to say no. Every calculation told me to be careful. I agreed to review the document, not to fix it, to review it. That choice nearly cost me everything. As I worked through the data, I realized something I hadn't seen before. An old workaround I'd built years ago, harmless at the time, now sat directly in the audit's line of sight. If flagged, it wouldn't just implicate management, it would implicate the person who designed it, me. The room felt smaller as that realization settled. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about survival. For the first time since this began, my hands shook. I stepped away from my desk and stood in the stairwell, counting breaths, reminding myself why I was here. I hadn't created this situation. I hadn't forced them to build on assumptions they never bothered to understand. But intent doesn't matter when consequences arrive. Documentation does, timing does, framing does. And suddenly everything depended on how one narrative was told. The reversal came quietly. I added a single appendix, factual, boring, impossible to argue with. It reframed the workaround as a temporary mitigation approved under prior leadership, now obsolete but never formally retired. True, incomplete, but true. It shifted accountability upward without drawing a line straight back to me. When compliance acknowledged receipt without follow-up questions, my knees nearly gave out. That was the cost of this path. Constant balance, constant risk. I didn't feel victorious. I felt older. That night, alone in my apartment, I stared at the reflection and barely recognized the person looking back. I'd become someone who thought in contingencies and exits, someone who measured trust like exposure. I asked myself a question I couldn't escape. If winning meant becoming someone I no longer recognized, would I still finish? The answer came without hesitation. I already had. There was no version of me left to return to. The next morning, everything accelerated. Senior leadership joined calls. Legal requested summaries. HR stopped pretending this was about morale and started asking about responsibility. Mark's authority eroded in real time. James looked like a man watching the floor fall away beneath him. And then, in the middle of a meeting meant to reassure everyone, Mark did something desperate. He looked directly at me. Not for help, for recognition. In that moment, I saw it land. The pattern, the timing, the way every crisis traced back to the absence of something rather than the presence of sabotage. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in understanding, the kind that arrives too late to matter. He didn't say my name, he didn't have to. The silence between us filled with something final. Because in that moment, Mark Reynolds finally realized who had been dismantling his world from the inside, and there was nothing left he could do to stop it.
The collapse didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived quietly, disguised as procedure. Calendars filled with meetings Mark wasn't invited to, emails he was CC'd on instead of leading, decisions made above him, then communicated downward like weather reports, unavoidable, impersonal, final. James lasted longer than I expected, mostly because people like him always do. He apologized often, took responsibility without understanding what that meant. It didn't save him, it just made the ending slower. Compliance findings were released in stages, each one stripping away a layer of authority. First, process failures, then oversight gaps, then the question no one asked out loud but everyone heard: who benefited from not knowing? Mark tried to frame it as systemic drift, as culture, as momentum. He was right and still finished. Systems don't absolve leaders, they indict them. When HR finally called me in, the tone was different from every conversation before it. Respectful, careful. They asked what I had lost, not what I wanted. Lost. I told them the truth. I told them about the future that had been implied and then withdrawn, about the years of unpaid responsibility, about the meeting where I was told I wasn't ready while someone else wore the outcome. I didn't accuse. I didn't dramatize. I laid out facts like artifacts. They listened because the damage had already taught them how. Mark resigned the following week. Personal reasons, the email said. James was reassigned, then quietly let go once the contract stabilized. No announcements, no public reckoning. That's how these things end. Not with spectacle, but with absence. Desks cleared, names removed from org charts, stories rewritten. And me? They offered me a role, a real one this time. Authority, scope, apologies disguised as opportunity. I took a long moment before answering. Long enough for the silence to do its work. I accepted, but not the job they expected. I negotiated terms that put distance between me and the machine that had tried to erase me. Control over my time, clear boundaries, accountability written down instead of implied. I didn't want revenge anymore. I wanted immunity. What I'd lost couldn't be restored. Not the version of myself who believed loyalty would be recognized, not the ease I used to carry into rooms, not the instinct to help without calculating the cost. But I reclaimed something else. Dignity, agency, the right to choose silence instead of submission. People asked me later how I stayed so calm, how I watched everything fall apart without intervening. I never answered directly, because the truth makes people uncomfortable. The truth is that I learned patience the hard way, that being underestimated is a position, not a weakness, that the loudest people in the room are often compensating for the quiet ones they didn't bother to understand. I didn't destroy anyone. I stopped protecting them. And when protection ends, reality does the rest. Sometimes I think about that meeting, the chair tilting back, the folded hands, the words, "not ready," delivered like a verdict. I wonder if Mark ever replays it the way I did, from different angles, what he saw, what he missed, what he assumed would never change. If he ever realized that moment wasn't the beginning of my revenge, but the confirmation that it would work. Because revenge, when it's real, doesn't look like anger. It looks like restraint. It looks like documentation. It looks like silence that lets people hear themselves clearly for the first time. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make threats. I didn't ask for fairness. I waited. And the loudest revenge I ever took was saying nothing.